Welcome to the Climate Hour. I'm your host, Bob Grove. Today we're going to talk about degrowth, the path from consumerism to survival. It's interesting how many of our Climate Hour topics find their roots in the 1950s, the aftermath of World War II, when the military-industrial complex gave birth to consumer plastics, to commercialized chemical farming, to the idea that everything in life could be bought from a corporate store, and to macroeconomic models of perpetual economic growth. Since then, this ongoing cycle of marketing and corporate expansion has moved society away from self-sufficiency to total dependence on corporations for all of our needs. It's also shifted the world's wealth and power from the middle class to a small handful of multi-billionaires who now control the marketplace and thus control the world. Those of us in the United States are certainly seeing the political fallout of perpetual economic growth, and so are other countries around the world. The problem with growth is that it's simply not sustainable. Any system that grows forever is eventually going to consume all available resources and collapse under its own weight. It doesn't matter if we're talking about households, corporations, or governments. Perpetual growth is not sustainable. Sustainability is about finding life's balance, producing enough to satisfy your customers' needs while earning enough to satisfy the needs of you and your coworkers. In contrast, perpetual economic growth is about a cycle of producing surplus, more than is needed, then using mass marketing to convince people to overconsume. Perpetual economic growth basically is consumerism. You, me, buying more than we need, more than is healthy for us. Fast fashion, fast food, commercial animal farming. These are all symptoms of the overconsumption required to maintain perpetual economic growth. Overconsumption that has led to poor health and a collapsing environment, to overshooting our planet's resources, and to climate change. You know, it's easy to blame the politicians and corporations. They are the ones that profit from all this growth, this overconsumption. But if we want to be honest, it's you and I that are doing the consumption. You and I choose to overconsume every day. We'd rather drop 20 bucks for an unhealthy fast food dinner than go home and put a nice can of soup in the microwave, much less go home and chop up some vegetables, add them to boiling water, and make our own soup or stew. We'd rather throw away a new shirt with a missing button than pick up the needle and sew that button back on. But let's get back to climate change. And here we go again, circling back to the 1950s. That's when fossil fuel industry scientists predicted today's global warming events and covered up their own research in the name of corporate growth, in the name of surplus, in the name of profits through the overconsumption of fossil fuels. So let's be clear, the climate crisis is a product of consumerism. And while there are many ways you and I can profitably lower our personal carbon footprint to reduce global warming and slow the climate crisis, we will never stop climate change until we address our overconsumption, our unsustainable expectations of perpetual economic growth. We need to find life's balance, to stop overshooting the planet's resources, and to degrow our economic expectations and halt consumerism. We're joined today on Zoom by Dr. Christopher Marquis. We talked about this earlier.
Yes.
By Dr. Christopher Marquis. Chris is the Senior Professor of Management at the University of Cambridge and author of The Profiteers, How Business Privatizes Profits and Socializes Costs. Chris has authored dozens of peer-reviewed academic articles and Harvard business cases on topics related to social innovation, sustainable business, and doing business in China. His research and writing on the need to rebalance the interactions between corporations, governments, and civil society to deliver socially and environmentally beneficial outcomes to all. Hi, Chris.
Hello, Bob. Great to be with you.
Jason Barahona is the program coordinator for the Degrowth Institute. Jason facilitates community talks, organizes the interdisciplinary exchange of ideas for action, and engages in writing and research. Hi, Jason.
Hi, Bob. Everyone here. Good to be here.
Dr. William E. Rees is Professor Emeritus and former Director of the University of British Columbia School of Community and Regional Planning. Bill is an ecologist, an ecological economist, and the originator and co-developer of ecological footprint analysis, an accounting method enabling the measurement of resource consumption. He is the recipient of a Herman Daly Award in Ecological Economics, the Blue Planet Prize, and is co-author of Our Ecological Footprint. Bill currently focuses on ecological overshoot and the biological, cultural, and behavioral barriers to effective environmental and economic development policy. Hi, Bill.
Good to be here, and thanks for the invitation.
Zaharia Drizin holds a Bachelor of Arts in Environmental Studies and a Master of Science in Sustainable Management from DePaul University. Zaharia has served on the Climate Mental Health Network's Generation Z Advisory Board. Hi, Zaharia.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Chris, let's start with you. Is today's dominant economic model of infinite growth, is it really compatible with planetary limits?
Yeah, absolutely not at all. I mean, as you mentioned, we've been in this sort of growth mindset for, since the 1950s at least, and probably even, before that. And I think, you highlighted a lot of consumer trends that have driven that. And I think that, perhaps even more significant and severe in creating this, ever escalating growth idea is investment markets. You have investors in large companies that are actually sort of pushing them to continually grow and increase their profits. And also the governments around the world use GDP and GDP growth as sort of the core, sort of measure of success. And I think that, you have states focusing on this, you have investment markets, and also, we as consumers, which really sort of create this perpetual cycle, which makes it a huge challenge because, as you mentioned, they're planetary limits. The Earth is not an ever expanding entity. There is actually limits to how much, resources and how much, sort of carbon emissions can be put in the atmosphere. So anyways, it is a fundamental challenge for the world.
Bill, you've talked about emergent consequences of global growth. I mean, how does that global growth compare to our non-growing ecosphere?
Well, I think Chris really put his finger on it. They're completely incompatible. People today tend to forget that the whole idea of growth as an economic policy, in fact, dates from the post-war period, the late 40s, early 50s. And in fact, we've had, 250,000 years of modern, anatomically modern human evolutionary history. But only 200 years, the last 2 centuries, has been characterized by growth that was measurable year on year. So only about 10 generations of humans out of thousands have actually experienced enough growth to notice. And yet we take this to be the norm. And it's part of our psychological addiction, really, that the most abnormal period in human history is now taken to be the norm and has been incorporated into all of our economic models. It doesn't matter whether they're capitalist or socialist or communist, they're all dedicated to this proposition of growth, which really raises another issue, and that is that human beings don't live in reality. We live out of socially constructed stories, and our economic system is a social construct that happens to be totally incompatible with the environment within which it operates.
So, Haria, from the Generation C advisory panel, I think your generation kind of has a unique perspective. Your entire life has been during this obvious period of overshoot. Bill talked about the different generations. How is your experience different than perhaps previous generations?
Well, I was like the first generation that in 3rd grade was learning about recycling and watched videos about polar bears dying and had all of this early, almost secondhand ecological trauma because people didn't know how to talk about climate change since it was just starting to be talked about at all, and there wasn't as much infrastructure in place to then properly educate children about it. And so I think my generation, there are many people who grew up in a state of climate crisis. But even if you didn't, you were kind of exposed to it in a very unprepared and in not very fully thought out way. And I think that has caused there to be a lot of environmental trauma in a way that my generation experiences, where people are either, right there out on the streets, or they're just completely in denial. And there's kind of like a little bit of in between. But I think the reaction that you see from my generation is very much a classic trauma reaction of, this is scary, and I was introduced to this from a very young age without much preparation, and now I'm reacting in whatever way I possibly can, whether that be, Gen Z internet culture of just kind of making fun of everything and pretending like it's not that serious and being sarcastic. It all kind of, to me, comes from this place of trying to cope with growing up in an unstable world, and an uncertain climate future.
You're kind of the transitional generation right now, the awareness. How do you think overshoot's going to affect future generations?
I think I think that's something that Gen Z is thinking a lot about, because Gen Alpha is the youngest generation, and Gen Z is starting to move into our 20s um, and get into the place where we're building our careers and considering our futures and building families. And so we're thinking a lot about what that will mean for future generations. And uh, I think it feels very daunting. And even me, having studied it for 5 years and understanding all of the, logically, all of the sociological and environmental factors that have contributed to it, it still doesn't make it feel very clear about what could potentially happen. So I can't imagine other people who haven't studied it for 5 years and how they're coping with it, and what that could possibly mean for future generations.
Jason, how does a concept like degrowth, I mean, you're with the Degrowth Institute, so the concept of degrowth, how does that help remedy the problems of our growth economy? Jason?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, a concept like degrowth introduces sort of that word degrowth kind of gives it a nice, just direct response to a question of what do you do when you have an outgrown economy? If you've decided that yes, the economy has outgrown the planet, which is a question that we've often been asking here at Degrowth Institute, in places like the global north, or specifically in the United States, the answer would be degrowth. But this might manifest differently in other places. Like, for example, I'm originally from Latin America, from Honduras. And conversations there might look at it more from this idea of post-growth. Or even Mexico has this word called descrecimiento instead of decrecimiento, just meaning that a separation from growth as opposed to a degrowth. Kind of recognizing that idea that they haven't quite reached whatever it is this overgrown economy level might be, but they are still heading in that trajectory. So this concept of degrowth is just recognizing the problem, kind of like a cancer research society, identifying it, diagnosing it, and then building a response around it.
So degrowth, the Degrowth Institute, you're kind of looking at as a general concept and then developing specific contexts for different audiences, different countries.
Correct. Mainly our focus is here in the United States, and really North America, but trying to really bring in all the different perspectives that exist here, right? It isn't just from the whatever we see as the managerial class or sustainability movements, but also touching on other existing movements that have been longstanding in this region of the world, but also continue to exist either through immigrants or other marginalized communities of the working class, and name a number of other groups here.
Okay. Bill, there's a lot of political action, what we might call acceptable approaches to addressing global warming. Are they really fixing the climate, or are they actually worsening the overshoot?
Well, there's two layers to that question, or two layers to the answer. First of all, no, they're not fixing the climate. We've been aware of real climate change for half a century now. In 1992, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was developed. Since then, there's been 29 COP meetings, all dedicated to reducing atmospheric carbon dioxide and emissions. And during this entire period, we've seen a steady increase in both emissions and atmospheric levels of carbon dioxide. So it's been a grotesque failure. I mean, things might have been worse in the absence of some of those activities, but certainly they've failed utterly in their primary objective of reducing atmospheric carbon dioxide. But I want to emphasize a couple of things here. There are no environmental problems. Climate change is one of many, many co-symptoms of the fundamental dysfunctional relationship between human activity and the ecosphere, in particular, growth-oriented industrialism, particularly as characterized by, I suppose, Western capitalist neoliberal economic growth-oriented mentality. So that's the source of our issue. At least that's the primary, or what I call the material source of all environmental problems. And you can't solve any of these so-called symptoms in isolation of the others. You said in the introduction that by focusing on climate change, we're really getting nowhere. And that's absolutely true. And we can't get anywhere by focusing on a single problem. That would be my major overlay on the climate issue. I want to raise something else here, though. When we talk about degrowth, we have to understand that the Earth is not now supporting 8 billion people. Overshoot means that we're depleting the natural capital basis that sustains the economy. It's like living on a bank account and gradually draining it down to zero. You don't notice you're at the bottom until you're at the bottom. So to correct that, we need to reduce overall economic throughput by at least 50%, which means 80% or more in North America, 60% or thereabouts in Europe. And it means population as well. We need population control before we can hope to have a couple of billion people living at a reasonable material standard. And all of those issues, but the population one in particular, but degrowth, that they're simply not on the table. There's no government anywhere on this planet seriously discussing how to grow or degrow the economy, shrink economic activity, and redistribute wealth and income so that there's a reasonable share going to the remaining populations.
That's a lot right there. Chris, what's your take on that? Is the are processes that are addressing global warming, or are they helping or making things worse?
Yeah, I don't think they're helping. And so I guess by definition, in some ways, they're making things worse because as Bill described, we are in this tremendous overshoot problem that gets worse and worse every year. I think it's, I mean, I think the US, we use sort of 5 times the, what we should really use as far as the sort of resources on the earth, and the overall, world is about 1.75 times, and it's getting worse and worse. We're using basically the resources of earth every year. And at some point, we're going to hit a brick wall, and it's not going to be a, sort of pretty situation. And so the ideas of degrowth, I think, are around sort of trying to, limit that growth so that we are actually, trying to, reduce that focus on the sort of continual use of energy and resources. And one of the things that I think is very frustrating to me is that, when you talk a lot about climate issues, people raise all of these technical solutions to it. Maybe there's, things like this direct air capture, which is like having a big giant vacuum cleaner that sucks the air out of the, sort of sucks CO2 out of the atmosphere, or things like geoengineering, spraying, various particles in the air to reflect the sunlight. And the thing is, and Bill had mentioned this around sort of capital, sort of the logic of capitalism, when you have technical fixes, those do not get distributed, the benefits of those do not get distributed equally around the world. They actually go to, the wealthy, which then actually, it leads to actually more sort of climate impact. I'm here at Cambridge University, where John Maynard Keynes was. And he thought back in the 1930s that because of technical increases, people would only work 15 hours a day. Well, maybe people don't have to work more than 15 hours a day. However, because of the investors in firms, in the capitalist system, the productivity from technical advances actually ends up being concentrated in, for the investors, and they keep wanting more and more growth themselves. So technology, while in theory it could help, because of the way the economic system is designed, it actually doesn't help at all.
So all these buzzes I'm reading about, the energy transition, green growth, cyclic economy, those going to work or not?
They're not going to work.
Not
Sad
only
thing.
that, if we can jump, and there's no such thing as an energy transition.
Yeah.
We're using more biomass, wood and animal dung today than in 1800. So after 200 years of growth and so on, we've simply added one form of energy to another. And, the electrification of the world is simply adding to the energy supply to enable continued growth. Chris made a really important point about who benefits and who gains. If you go online and just ask questions about investment in climate change, you'll see that all the acceptable solutions from the mainstream involve massive capital investment, and they're sold to investors on the basis of profit-making potential and job creation. So everybody buys into this because it's an extension of the status quo, and it's the status quo that is killing us. So the opportunities for profits are true, and they go to the rich, while the poor suffer the consequences of the enormous increase in pollution that results from the mining and refining and manufacturing associated with the so-called electrical transition, or the transition to green energy. It's a massive increase in energy and resource throughput. All, so-called renewable green energy is built using fossil fuel, which is another reason why emissions haven't gone down during this period of so-called transition. So we're in a circle. It's a vicious cycle. In our efforts to maintain the status quo, we simply perpetuate the very problem that we're trying to solve in the first place and make it worse.
Zoharia, how does Gen Z reckon their personal consumption with national consumption? How is that being balanced?
So, obviously, I should have prefaced this, but I don't represent my whole generation.
Of course.
Really? I'm sure I represent mine, so.
Yeah.
I think Bill does.
Yeah, and also like the idea of Gen Z is a very American thing. It's a very specific to the socio-political environment of America, and there are some similarities across international borders just due to the rise of the internet and people being able to share information. But again, it's, I think Gen Z, yes, it's a very American thing. And so, yeah, I think the way that I, it's going to use I pronouns, first person pronouns, the way that I reckon personal consumption with national consumption is, I think there's a sense among the educated, like the community of my generation that's educated about environmental risks, that we can just do our best, but nothing's really going to change the inevitable, tornado that will tear down the barn. And so it's like the idea of personal consumption for many people that I know and myself is more from an educational perspective of I will recycle, I will change my diet, I will change, my lifestyle in order to show people that there's other ways to go about it. Not that me doing this will actually have any impact on the global environmental condition, but that by me doing that, I'm showing people that there's another way, and that it that we can imagine other worlds, other possible versions of society than the one we currently have. And yeah, Chris.
Oh no, I'm sorry. Go finish up. I was just saying, I know obviously we want to get Jason in again, but this idea of consumption, I just want to make that I think actually, I think I agree with you 100% that that we need to be doing our best, but in many ways, actually the idea that individuals and consumers are going to save us is a distraction as well. This has actually been perpetuated by a lot of large companies, like the idea of personal carbon footprints, was put out there by BP. Idea of plastic recycling and the sort of numbers inside on the bottom of plastic. Actually, that ends up being a big scam as well from the plastics industry because they don't want actually to take the responsibility themselves. Actually, if you look at carbon emissions, I think in the last, since 1970, it's actually like it's about 100 companies that are responsible for 70% of carbon emissions. So we should actually really be focusing on we should do our best, certainly, but really we should be training our attention on these large companies, not sort of worrying about, whether we're eating meat or whatever. So anyways, I just want to add that I think, it's important to be conscious consumers, but that's actually just a distraction in many ways that companies are trying to shift the responsibility away from themselves.
Yeah, and I would say that is a much more eloquent way of saying what I was trying to express. But I think that the idea of personal consumption is obviously in many ways like kind of this distraction. And I think that's what I'm trying to get at, is that reduction of personal consumption, at least among me and my peers, is viewed more as a way to then like start that conversation about that greater corporate kind of influence. Like you talk with especially intergenerationally, like, oh, you're recycling, why are you doing that? And then it starts a conversation versus, oh, this is because this will, I saw a statistic that like if every American reduced all their personal consumption, like there still would be,
Sure.
it still wouldn't change the grand scheme of global, like American national pollution output. So I think that at least, I mean, I can't speak for everyone in my generation, but I think that at least me and among my peers that have studied environmental science, that have been in environmental activism spaces, it's viewed as a conversation starter and something to keep yourself, a ritual, to keep yourself remembering that this is something that's going on and not just becoming like mentally complacent, which is very easy to do.
You're listening to the Climate Hour. I'm your host, Bob Grove. We're speaking with Zaharia Drizin, Christopher Marquis, Jason Barahona, and William Reese about degrowth, the path from consumerism to survival. Jason, let's come back around to you. We've been talking about generational differences and personal versus corporate actions. I mean, where does the Degrowth Institute come from? What are you focusing on?
Yeah, earlier I mentioned that, right, there's a lot of different levers that we can sort of touch on if we think about, let's say the United States is a big machine, and there are, like I was mentioning before, industry and working class levels. There's the levers of civil rights action, but really as of late we've focused on the sustainability research collective, let's say. So when I say that, I'm talking about those researching sustainable claims or sustainable solutions in the universities or for these larger corporations. So right, these are the people who are looking at how can we increase efficiency, or how can we reduce the amount of time that we spend on certain processes, or how can we add another green label to this building or to this product, right? All these things are really, at the end of the day, just another way to get us off the hook and continue perpetuating this idea of economic growth. So what we're finding is that as we move into these spaces, so right when we're going to say, for example, we take a trip to a university and we talk about this question of just not even just talking about degrowth, right? The intentional downscaling of the global economy for the purpose of social and ecological justice. Not just saying that definition, but posing the question of what happens to the savings. A lot of people in the sustainability world seem to have not just like pumped the brakes and thought about that question. What happens to the savings? Be that what happens to the money savings, what happens to the time savings, what happens to the energy savings, and getting at this idea that when we reduce the amount of X thing being used, is it then being redeployed somewhere else, either within their scope of work, be that somewhere else in the company, somewhere else in the university, or just in the larger economy. And that this really has started to bring up just a whole shift in people's framing of what these quote unquote sustainable actions have been. So this is one big target that we've been focusing on in our work here at Degrowth Institute.
Okay, thank you.
Good.
Chris, let's jump back.
Looks
Oh,
like
can I
Bill has
read?
some- Bill, yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to just pick up on something Jason's talking about here. And he's really referring to something called the rebound effect or the Jevons effect. People think that efficiency gains are going to make a big difference, but almost invariably it results in lower prices and increased consumption. And so you need some other mechanism to make efficiency gains have an effect, which raises the point I really wanted to get at because it picks up on something Zaharia was talking about. This is a collective problem. Unsustainability is a collective problem affecting the whole of the human species and every country. It requires collective solutions. Individual actions, while interesting and nice and perhaps a useful demonstration, have almost no effect. I think 10% is the maximum you'd get out of it. So we need collective action, which means government action on behalf of the common good. Now, if you look at what's happening in the United States, it's a complete dismantling of the very notion there is a common good, that there is a social purpose behind government policy. And so we're going backwards as fast as you can, and it's happening elsewhere in the world with the turn to the right. Deregulation is the mantra of the day. Drill, baby, drill is one of Trump's most famous or popular comments. So we have to understand here that the whole of our, I suppose, the vested interests in maintaining the ethic of growth are fighting in every way to prevent the recognition that this is a collective problem that requires collective solutions. The way to fix the efficiency thing, for example, is through ecological tax reform. Everything we purchase today in the marketplace is underpriced because the real costs have been externalized to the environment. Not all the costs, but the ecological and social costs of production aren't reflected in the prices you pay. So governments could impose ecological taxes that raise the prices to closer to their true social cost. That would prevent the rebound effect from occurring because you could get the efficiency, but higher prices would prevent higher consumption. But we don't think in these terms because it would actually fix the problem. And the reality is the mainstream is not in the least interested in fixing the problem. What they're interested in is maintaining the status quo. If possible, the phrase I use is the status quo by alternative means, or business as usual by alternative means. New technologies, new fixes, but we're just going to carry on messing up the planet and distributing wealth in a totally inequitable and disastrous way through the current growth method.
Chris, Bill just commented on the government pullback from climate change, which, putting more pressure on the corporates, voluntary commitments. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, share Bill's sentiment that it's a disastrous for, the world, for the United States. I think, most of the large companies that have been public and it seem to be actually, happy with this. It's less constraint on their action. There's this large, just just in the last number of weeks or month, the Business Roundtable, which is the large trade group for the largest U.S. companies, actually came out and requested to actually have a ban on shareholder proposals on climate issues. So, this is something where, I think that many large businesses are rejoicing that there's been this pullback on climate, and I think it's really disastrous for the world. And it's, I'm a professor at a business school, so I engage with a lot of businesses. I'm relatively skeptical. The research I do looks at companies greenwashing and basically trying to evade regulations to sort of understand how and why they do that and how things can be designed to stop that. So I'm pretty skeptical, but even, the extent to which people have, clearly were lying in the past about their commitments is shocked even me. That said, there are companies that I feel like are passionate about the environment and social impact. They're smaller companies typically, but there are, companies that I think are doing good in this space, but the majority are sort of lockstep in line with this, cutback on environmental commitments.
For a pretty dreary forecast we're all sharing here.
Yeah.
Jason, you mentioned the global north earlier. Could you expand on that? I mean, the differences between global north, global south, and how consumption imbalances are affecting that?
Yeah, kind of like I was mentioning before, how degrowth sort of is viewed in these different locations, and even within them, can really shift based on even like economic status. But right, the most obvious are just that the United States and the way that we think about degrowth is really, like I was saying before, a degrowing of the global economy would more than likely mean, or obviously mean, a degrowing of the US economy. But right, still framing that as intentional, not accidental, intentional, and for the purpose of social and ecological justice. If we don't factor those things in, we're missing a lot of the goals and points that we want to be doing with this degrowth movement. But in places like Peru, Colombia, Honduras, from you hear these concepts of degrowth, but also buen vivir, which is just good life, good living. These are coming from long-standing indigenous ideas and just cultures that pervade within these realms of the world. But this is a complicated thing to bring up. This should not be conflated with that everybody in the global south is somewhat super virtuous and just understands that we all need to just stay at a certain level. People in the global south also want to see economic gains. They also you can look at these different governments and you'll see also that they're trying to figure out how to industrialize and tap into these other modes of what has been viewed as advancement for the past 80 or so years, but that have led to destruction. So when we talk about degrowth, we want to kind of keep this dialogue open for what does it mean for a global north that has set somewhat of a bad example, really, for what growth can look like when you're talking about well-being of humans and the planet. But then also separating ourselves from diagnosing and then giving people in, for say, Latin America, say Sub-Saharan Africa, say other parts of Asia, or even within the United States, right? Here in Chicago, where I'm at, there's a wide range of different economic statuses, and that get to benefit from wealth where others don't. So just getting away from this monolithic conversation and understanding that there will need to be both, yes, a government structure that talks about this in a way that starts to provide caps, provide limits, but also a cultural restructuring, a buy-in for these ideas as well.
Chris?
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up a little bit on the global north, global south idea a little bit differently than Jason, to build on something that Bill mentioned, is that, Bill mentioned these externalities that actually, everything we buy is actually cheaper than it should be because there are all these social and environmental impacts that we as the common good are taking. And it's actually we in the global north are the externalities in many cases are actually happening in sort of the global south, Latin America, Asia, Africa, where supply chains are, and there's horrible labor conditions and poor environmental conditions. And so I think it becomes very easy, this very much out of sight, out of mind, that a lot of the impacts of our decisions are actually very, very far from home. And that's an important aspect of this as well, because those societies are the ones that are actually mostly, or we're going to be much more on the front lines of climate damage than many of the places where we all live.
And waste products. I mean, most of
Right.
the plastics, the fashions, all of that's being exported to the global south. So we don't really face our own waste conditions. Bill,
Exactly.
what's your thoughts on
Yeah.
renewable resources? Are they a solution? And what about the waste
No.
issues?
It's hard to talk about these things all at once. Let me pick up though on something Chris said before we get into that. Look, 20%, maybe 25% of the world's population are responsible through consumption for about 75% of the ecological problems. And a large part of that is because of globalization. I think we have to recognize that globalization and free trade, wonderful idea from the perspective of growing the economy, but that's precisely the point. It was a mechanism to enable capital to seek out cheap resources and cheap labor so that prices would fall in the north to enable enormous consumption. But what it has done in ecological terms on a finite planet is to expose remaining pockets of resources to an ever-growing population of ever richer consumers. And it has therefore accelerated the rate at which wealthy people in the north have depleted the assets of the planet and polluted much of the planet, and in particular, those parts of the southern countries that have taken on our manufacturing. I remember years ago when I was in Toronto, everybody was celebrating the cleaning up of air quality, but it was simply because we had offloaded our dirty manufacturing industries to China and Vietnam and so on. So there's a huge divide. We benefit in the north from the deprivation or degradation occurring in the south through pollution and resource extraction. That's an extremely important element of this degrowth thing, because it requires that we recognize that if you're going to have any kind of equity on Earth, it means, listen, 80% less consumption in the north of energy and material to create the ecological space so that people in southern countries can have a decent, not a high end, but just a decent material standard of living. And if we don't concede that, then there's no solution to this problem. And in my opinion, we won't concede that. We're in a predicament for which there are no easy solutions. There will be outcomes. We can help determine what those outcomes might be, but we can't solve the overall problem through any mechanism that we have at hand right now. Sorry.
No reason to be sorry. That's the situation. It is hard to consume, though. I mean, just take that in, and what do we do? What do we do? I'm always looking for solutions. So, Hari, what are your thoughts?
Here you go. Yes, perfect transition. So I think these are all really important thoughts and ideas and cultural and economic realities. But what does that actually mean for the average person who's living their life? And I think there's a lot of research. I know there's a lot of research about how climate change impacts mental health and impacts the ability to then cope with new and additional disasters and socioeconomic conflicts and political unrest. in individuals and within communities. And we touched on that a little bit earlier about like Jason, I'm also in Chicago. We also touched a little bit about how it's very disproportionate throughout even just one city, the experience of climate change. And I know just even the difference between me, who grew up in Chicago, and my partner, who also grew up in Chicago. He grew up right next to a factory, and his sense of smell is not as good as mine. And, you know, he grew up in an environment where just he would wake up and the air would smell weird. And that affected his idea of what the world looks like. And it's a very different perspective than where I grew up in a more middle to upper class community that was teaching me about recycling and personal consumption. You know, they didn't even have recycling in his community, you know, so it's a completely different, the approach to helping people needs to be very multifaceted in order to best provide everyone the resources to cope with these problems. And I think providing a very, you know, a unique and culturally adaptive approach is necessary, instead of creating one kind of general idea of here are a list of things that everyone can do to feel better. You know, every community is different, and that's just within the city, much less within the country and within the world. So really relying on local mental health experts, relying on local doctors and people who are trained in sociology, and also trained in biophysics and, like, you know, the ecological condition of our world, to come together and create culturally inclusive approaches to help support members of our own communities, so that people can develop coping strategies and be able to build resilience, which I think there's a severe lacking of. There's a severe lacking of ecological resilience, of social resilience, and thus of emotional resilience in this case. And so I can't say I can't prescribe one thing for everyone. I don't even have the jurisdiction to prescribe anything for that matter. But I think it's leveraging those networks and really building on community, religious organizations, community organizations that have influence on people's lives, to start having these conversations and let people have spaces to talk about how it feels. And that's so important. You know, stress, it causes so much illness. And if you are feeling stressed about something, especially something as existential as the climate crisis, or as even existential as not being able to drink the water that comes out of your faucet, you're not going to be able to, like, you're going to be at a higher risk for other disease, and you're not going to be able to, you know, best support your family going into the very kind of uncertain future of our planet. So I think, you know, for the people who maybe don't have access to the rich academic literature about this, all of these amazing terminologies and complicated, you know, theories, I think degrowth is kind of one of them in some ways. It's figuring out, what does this mean to you? What does this mean to your family? And how can we create networks to help you be able to thrive in the best way possible in such a chaotic, and, you know, create cosmos in the chaos of this current global state.
Yeah, that's very well said. I mean, it's what can we do individually? It's always kind of my focus. Hearing a lot of talk about corporate action, joint action, I mean, governmental action. We see the problems with that today. Bill, what do you see as the alternative? I mean, let's talk about solutions now. What's the alternative to this, you know, modern techno-industrial society we're dealing with?
Well, you're asking for solutions, and I think we put ourselves in a situation in which there's no ready withdrawal. We're in a situation which just the sheer scale of the human enterprise and its utter dependence on a consistent, dependable, reliable flow of energy and resources that cannot be sustained because of planetary limitations means that any form of withdrawal is going to be very painful. I said a couple of times, we need to reduce consumption by a very large margin. Listen, overshoot is a simple concept. We're using resources faster than they regenerate. And we're filling waste sinks faster than nature can recycle or process that waste. The only solution is reduced material throughput, reduced consumption of resources, and reduced pollution. Anything else, anything that we've proposed so far increases both of those things. So we're going nowhere until we face the reality that overshoot requires less, and more less. Now the question is, how do you do that in a just and equitable manner? Because as Jason has emphasized, a large proportion of the world, 1 billion people, don't have any energy supply to speak of beyond animal dung and biomass. Another 2 billion have unreliable energy supplies. The rest of us are, frankly, reaching peak energy consumption in Europe and America now, and it's going to be downhill from here, and we're going to see an increasing scrabble for the remaining energy resources on the planet because people will be trying to sustain the status quo. So the first step we have to make, and I don't know if we can do this, is a universal mental reset where we abandon the beliefs, values, and assumptions behind neoliberal capitalist growthist economics and adopt a different set of beliefs, values, and assumptions that are compatible with the fundamental steady state reality of material throughputs in the world. Now, let me just illustrate this in a simple way. A lot of people glom onto the idea of recycling. We've heard about this a lot today as a major solution to the problem. There are dozens of organizations around the world dedicated to this proposition. Just recycle everything. But listen, first of all, energy is not recyclable. It's consumed once. It's a throughput, unidirectional throughput. Energy is the basis of the economy. It cannot be recycled. Secondly, only a tiny fraction of actual materials in the economy do get recycled, something like 30% of paper and 10% of plastics and so on. And even if you tried your damnedest to get that higher, it uses more energy and material in the collection process and so on and so forth. But most fatally, if you are growing, recycling diminishes the whole exercise. If you double the economy so that you double economic throughput, then 100% recycling simply means you still need twice as much stuff to operate the economy, even at 100% recycling if you double the economy in terms of its material throughput, which, by the way, the world expects to happen within the next 40 years. So we are in a predicament of unprecedented proportion. It's this complete disconnect now between a non-growing, in fact, shrinking biosphere and a constantly growing human enterprise for which there are no easy solutions that do not involve a massive rethinking of our fundamental place in the ecosphere. So that's the solution, Bob. When you can convince 8 billion people to reform their economic and material ambitions, to get a quarter of those people to reduce what they already have by a fraction of 80%, to enable a few percentage increase at the lower end of the scale, but now you're moving towards solutions to this conundrum. Whether you can do that is a whole other issue. I suspect it's going to be a challenge beyond the capacity, particularly in the age of post-truth. This is the post-truth era, where the internet has taken over information generation, and it's turned the world into a massive global Tower of Babel, because 80% of what goes up on the internet is nonsense. I'm making that number up, but a lot of it is. And people are divided into hundreds of thousands of little chat groups, many of which are talking in circles. There's no connection among them. We no longer have a community water fountain where we could, stand around and talk about the common problems. So we're in a hell of a mess at least from my perspective, no matter how I look at this. I do not see how we can recreate the global mindset. It's a worldview. We need a transformation on a personal and civilizational level to a new way of thinking about the relationship between the human enterprise and the ecosphere. And if that doesn't happen, then it will crash. There will be a crash in the next 30 to 50 years.
I would,
Chris. Go ahead, Sahara.
and I don't want to, I know I've taken up a good amount of time already, but actually, you know what? No, I am allowed to take a break as a woman.
Take all the time you want.
I'm taking that back. I think that it is a privilege to be cynical about the future of the world. It is a privilege because it's a privilege that I don't share. Because for me, 2050, the day that this year, this like apocalyptic year, that's when I'm turning 50 years old. Right? That's my midlife crisis. And, you know, and it's like, okay, I don't know if I feel like, you know, I struggled with this when I first started learning about the current state of our planet. And there was a point where I was like, is it even worth it to continue living? If I'm going to be completely honest, you know, is it even worth it? And I think as somebody in my generation, I have to maybe not hope in its more idealistic form, but I have to have a sense of a surety that a motivation to keep going. And I think that hopelessness, that feeling of just exponential devastation in a way, to use economic terms associated with emotional experiences, is something that many people in my generation experience. And there was recently a Lancet study in, I believe it was November of 2024, that polled Americans, youth, and that came out to show that like the vast majority of youth are concerned about climate change, and on a bipartisan state would vote in accordance with climate friendly protocols because they are concerned about their future. And so I think that, you know, that change is starting. That global change that you're talking about is starting, and I see it in my own community. I see it at this national level, at least among my generation, and I also see it with my international friends that are also doing ecological work and talking about having these conversations with people. So for me, I think I don't. And perhaps it's just my black and white thinking, but I think you either have faith in the future and hope to create a world that, you know, do your best to create a world that's possible for me to even feel comfortable bringing children into, or I can just be like, you know, whatever, it's not worth it. And I'm telling you, many people my age are just like, you know, this isn't worth it, you know, like they live in a state of nihilism. And that's, what is that going to do for the future of politics and social construction? And, you know, like, what is that going to do? So for me, I think it's, yes, what you're saying, building those community networks and acknowledging that the change is happening. Will it happen fast enough? Who knows? But it's happening, and people care, and people are doing everything that they can to, you know, people are doing everything that they can to ensure the futures of their family and make sure that their houses aren't going to be flooded. And, you know, maybe it's not the people who have the microphone, but it's everyone else.
Let me be clear, Zaharia. I'm not trying to say give up. I'm saying don't waste your time focusing on things that aren't going to solve the issue that we're dealing with here. And that's what most people are doing. They're frittering with symptoms that are not at the root of the causes of those symptoms. And what's at cause here is the way we think we are on the planet, that we are exceptional, not bound by the rules of nature, that we can overcome any natural imposition by the ecosphere. We need to realize that that way of thinking is what's killing us. It's the thing that leads to the technological approach It's the thing that leads to crazy schemes for geoengineering, which in my view can only make things worse because we have no idea of the complexity of the systems with which we are dealing here. So by all means, maintain your optimism, maintain your commitment, but focus on the things that matter, not the symptoms. This is a way of being on the planet.
Yeah. And I would say that I would say that newer generations are focusing on that because we don't have any other option in many ways. We were fed from childhood that reduce, reuse, recycle. Some of us were fed from childhood that reduce, reuse, recycle, that the ice caps are melting. You have to, don't idle your car, and you've seen that that's not doing anything. And so I think that that's not creating the impact that we were promised as children. And so I guess my argument is that I think that that's already begun, that
Yeah,
process.
what they didn't tell you is that you don't have a car.
Yeah,
I'm serious. That's the nature of the change we're talking about.
Yeah. of course. Yeah.
Chris, you work a lot with corporations, companies. I mean, that's kind of your study. Is it really possible for them to rethink their product cycle to address overshoot and reduce consumption?
I think it's very, very hard. I mean, I am, I think, very sympathetic with Bill's perspective. I do think we need to have hope. I think all of us, we wouldn't all, sort of five of us would not be here if we actually did not believe in change and hope. So thank you, Bob, for convening this. And I think that hopefully this reaches some people and helps them understand things. But, I'm generally, sympathetic with what Bill was saying about how steep the challenges are, and I think that as was described, it's a whole way of thinking about the world. I bet you there are people that are going to listen to this and think that we are crazy in the things that we are saying, but actually, I firmly believe that the relationships that we're talking about are backed up by evidence, and that those people are actually the crazy ones. But anyways, no offense, listeners. But how I think about this and how I keep my hope, it actually comes back to what Bill was saying at the beginning of our discussion, in that the world that we're in right now is constructed, or so the economic world we're in right now of this growth idea, neoliberal, was actually constructed by various interested actors. This is not the natural way things are. You look earlier than 70 or so years ago, it actually, the sort of economic model was different. And so thinking about how, through, a variety of publications, a variety of governmental regulations, a variety of incentives for companies, this model has taken hold in a very firm way. So it's very natural for us to think this way. And so, when I'm working with companies, I really am trying to focus a lot on their supply chains, actually, because I think that if you think about, I don't know, even starting the design of products, if you think about ways, sort of the externalities deep in the supply chain, that is one way to, at a company level, to get at some of the roots of this. But it's creating those practices that can be spread, that can be put into law, that can finally be sort of thought about cognitively among people, is a very long journey. We might not have enough time actually for that journey, sadly. But I do think there's possible, change paths.
Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. This has been a strong conversation. There's a lot of issues brought up, a lot of viewpoints here, and I'm sure our listeners will enjoy all this. Where can our listeners go to learn more about your work, Jason?
Yeah, you can find my work at degrowthinstitute.org. We are working on continuing this, arriving at where people are. Like Bill mentioned earlier, in this sort of misinformation age, online can only get us so far. I know we are on a Zoom meeting, but being there in person with other people, talking about this, struggling through kind of like these mental cobwebs, these intertwined cables, and just untangling them. We're going to continue that tour. But then also, you can find on our website some big events coming up here this summer, where we will be convening in Chicago to continue to look for next steps, both in businesses and government policy, and within the community as well.
Zaharia, where would you send people to learn more about you in this topic?
Yeah, so I would send you to climatementalhealth.net. And if you want, it's a ton of resources about climate mental health, but the Gen Z Advisory Board of 2024 actually created a Gen Zine, which is like a grassroots magazine, a compilation of people's poetry and writings and art about mental health and coping with mental health in the time of crisis. So that's under the resources tab at climatementalhealth.net, and it's free to download. So if you like it, I hope you let us know. I think you will.
Bill, where can people go to learn about you and your books?
Well, I'm retired, so I don't maintain a personal website, but if you go to William Rees YouTube, there's probably a dozen lectures that other people of mine have recorded, or a dozen lectures of mine that other people have posted and seem to carry through. So I don't need to do it myself. William Rees, YouTube.
Thank you. And Chris, where can people go to learn more about you?
So I do have a website. I'm not yet retired. And my website is my name, chrismarquis.com. And people can learn about the research that I've done and also get in touch with me if they want to.
Yeah, me too. That's a good point. William Rees, W. Rees at ubc.mail.ca. William Rees. Yeah, okay, never mind. At mail.ubc.ca.
Thank you. And thank you to our listeners. We welcome your questions and feedback. You can learn more about the Climate Hour at climatehour.net. That's climatehour.net. This is the Climate Hour. I'm your host, Bob Grove.